Hello and welcome back one and all to the 28th day of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. We've had a good look through the one and only Felissa Rose's films to date, so for the next couple of days I wanted to do some slightly special episodes. One of the things that I missed out the first time round was the anthologies, which Felissa Rose has actually done quite a few of, just because I thought that I'd do better talking about the films in which you actually played a larger part. But now that we've kind of been through most of the bigger or more interesting Felissa Rose films, I figured that it would be kind of fun to check out some of her anthology work, because you never know what you're going to get, right? Unfortunately, I really wish I hadn't bothered, because there's certainly not much fun to be had with either of the two films that I am going to be talking about today, which are 2013's The Perfect House, also known as The Fear, and 2016's Terror Tales. I think that it makes sense to talk about The Perfect House first, because that was the first of these that I watched, and I can honestly say that it is one of the bleakest, nastiest, most soul-destroyingly nihilistic films that I have ever watched. It's just this total gloom fest from beginning to end. The framing story here is this young couple being shown around a house, whilst the various segments are just kind of slotted in at random points, and all basically fit the patterns of stories happening in a house. All three stories, let me tell you, are exercises in merciless viewer punishment about hideous people torturing and maiming innocent victims. There isn't a single ray of light or joy in this film, and it's such a one-note exercise in sadistic bleakness that it actually ends up getting quite ridiculous in how eager it is to make you suffer. But it's absolutely zero fun, and not in that way of a film that's just crappy and awfully made. I will actually concede that The Perfect House is, from a technical standpoint, quite a well-shot, competently directed film with some decent acting in it. What I will not say, though, is that there's anything to recommend you to watch this one. The only thing I will say, though, is that Felissa Rose, as a mother who's being tortured, of course, gives a very strong performance, but it really gets lost in the shuffle. Sitting through The Perfect House is one of the most masochistic experiences that I've ever been through, and not in a good way. There is not much more that I can say about it really, other than that it's a film to watch if you enjoy watching normal people being slowly tortured in gruesome sadistic fashions, well past the point when you get the message. I really think that, and I don't say this lightly, a little bit of me probably died inside watching The Perfect House because it's such just a brutal and ugly film that it actually depressed me. It didn't revolt me or disgust me or scare me, it depressed me that so much time and effort had been spent with a director who's technically competent, who thinks that a film about wall-to-wall cruelty and nastiness is all that horror fans want. I mean, you hear people moaning about sadism and violence in horror films all the time, and most of the time they're wrong to do so. People slag off the Saw films, for example, as being nothing but an excuse to show torture scenes, when the reality is that those are really big, energetic, bloody thrill rides with ups and downs, and the nastiness in those films, more often than not, feels earned, not like it's all that there is. With The Perfect House, we've got three separate shorts, and what's happened is, rather than having a story with ups and downs that builds to a crescendo of really ugly, brutal violence with characters that we care about, everything has been stripped away from these stories until what we're left with are segments of extended torture and brutality that start when the nasty stuff starts and end when the poor fuckers are dead. It's stuff that only works when you've got the full context, and isolating the nastiest moments that you get in usually the cheapest, nastiest horror films means that we're left with something that feels like an endurance test, even though it is so ridiculously single-minded in trying to tell you that humanity is fucked. There is an argument to be made that this is the film that I've hated the most out of the entire month, and believe me, that is some stiff competition. I mean, both Ugly Sweater Party and The Demented were truly irredeemably awful films, but I think that there's few films that I've seen lately that just left me feeling so fucking depressed as this one. And not in any kind of spiritually cleansing martyrs type way, but just in this way that makes you feel angry that you've wasted your time. I'm coming in at a nice, solid 1 out of 10 for The Perfect House, because rating it any higher would suggest that I think this is in any way a film that contributes anything to humanity other than trendy, meaningless sadism. Is it worse than The Demented? Well, there's a point at which you just stop, isn't there, and you're comparing different kinds of shit. It's all in a big pile of things that just shouldn't ever have been made. So that takes us on to what by default is a better anthology film, which is 2016's Terror Tales, but the sad thing is it's not really that much better objectively, but is at least vaguely watchable. For one thing, it is over 2 hours long, which is kind of crazy for a film with an obviously low budget, especially considering it's only got 3 segments plus a framing story. The framing story is actually unusually well developed and definitely stands up by itself. About this crazy gunman who takes a family hostage and goes on a road trip with the father, whereupon he shares with him a series of fucked up stories. The first story features an actress called Lynn Lowry, who you might be familiar with from doing a load of genre stuff stretching right back to the 70s. She plays an author who poisons her son, and she meets up with this cool looking ink demon that does a kind of sinister Christmas Carol type thing, looking back at her life. It's a little bit pointless, but the creature design here is pretty nice. Then story 2 runs to a full 40 minutes and is this really kind of overdone 1980s set story about a video store called Radical Video, and this series of brutal sledgehammer murders taking place around the vicinity. It does all the kind of obvious 80s tropes and turns them up to fucking 12. If you love all this shit, you might like this story, but to be honest, it's less of a loving homage than a massively overdone pastiche of the 1980s, because nothing in the 80s was ever quite this, 80s. But then, almost every cheap horror film ever made these days claims to be an 80s throwback, so I'm sure this one will have more lovers than it does haters. It is a bit crude, it's a bit nasty, but it's also so long that you end up getting impatient for the next story to start, which I think is a definite problem with an anthology. One of the joys of the whole format is that you're constantly wondering what's going to come next, and if one particular segment kind of drags its heels a bit too much, then you run the risk of it all feeling stagnant. But at least it is actually a proper story. I think the coolest thing about it though is that it features a performance from a genuine 1980s star, and that is Laureen Landon, who is a familiar face from various sword and sorcery and or post-apocalyptic films of the 80s, as well as of course showing up in Maniac Cop and various others, and her performance in this has to be seen to be believed because it is fucked. It is almost Aunt Martha levels of fucked. Story 3 of 3 is where we finally get our little bit of Felissa Rose, and this is maybe the strangest of the 3 stories because it's really terrible, as well as being very funny, and I find myself constantly thinking throughout how much of this is actually intentional, because it really is quite hard to tell. I think it's easily the most fun of the 3, it's quite a cool little spin on this possession kind of story involving centuries-old evil that hops from body to body, and a father confronting his faith. There's moments of out-and-out silliness here that kind of make you wonder if this is knowingly spoofy, but there's also stuff that's fairly serious. But it does get plus points for being very ambitious, it lasts about half an hour, and it also gets a thumbs up from me for committing to a full demon costume, which I always like to see. The bizarre thing is, though, that even Felissa Rose seems to have been infected by the is this bad or is it meant to be approach, because some of her acting in this is amongst her least convincing work ever, never mind the fact that it's quite a weak part for her. She plays a witch in the segment's 17th century Salem witch hunt flashback scene, and she does this kind of seductive writhing which somehow looks really unconvincing, although maybe it's just because it's very flatly and pedestrianly filmed. Then, as we head out of the third segment, the wraparound finishes itself off pretty straightforwardly with a twist that's very much in the vein of a particular Creepshow story. On the whole, it's a film that's a lot longer than it needs to be, but it does have a kind of simple low-budget charm to it. It's obvious that the filmmakers are most impressed with the middle segment in the VHS shop, just because it's so long and it seems to have been designed to appeal to the vocal horror fans who can't shut up about how rad the 80s were. I think Terror Tales is okay. The biggest problem is that it's just very long. I don't think any of the stories are great, to be honest, they're all a little bit lackluster, although story 3 is entertaining in ways that I'm not entirely sure were intentional. But compared to the deliberately antagonistic stripped-back sadism of something like The Perfect House, it is definitely by far the better of these two. I'm going for, I think, a 4 out of 10 for Terror Tales, which is fairly generous, I've got to say. But I am going to wrap things up for here now, though. This has been day number 28 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose, a look at a couple of fairly disappointing anthologies. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, thanks for your time, thanks for stopping by, and I shall see you tomorrow for the next one, where we'll be looking at another pair of Felissa Rose anthologies. Bet you can't wait for that, eh? Well, you're gonna have to, but we'll see you in the next one, alright? Don't be late.